All right, Bredette, thank you for joining us. I just, it's kind of you to obviously give up your time speaking to us. I just want you to sort of tell the group about your flying career, where it all started, from the start to where you are now, and then when you've sort of finished, we'll just ask questions. There's no time limit, so just take your time, just tell us everything you want to tell us, and we'll go from there.
Well, that would take up the full hour.
Well, that's fine. That's if that's how it is, we're quite happy for that. So take
where I got the bug to fly was I was born 1 week before Pearl Harbor. Now, I know you all were in the war way before then, but the United States was dragging their feet. And when my dad went off to war, he was in the U.S. Navy, and he was stationed in the Far East around Japan. He was at Okinawa, the Battle of Okinawa, and was in that big typhoon there. Anyway, when he left, he gave me a toy airplane, and I was about 3 years old, and I remember it very well, and I was fascinated with that. We lived in San Francisco at the time. In San Francisco, they had airplanes filling the air all the time, and I would go outside and watch that, and I was just enamored with airplanes. And we moved back to Texas, where I was born, and where we lived the rest of my life, and the rest of my life until I went to school. And in Texas, we lived about 15 miles from Perrin Air Force Base. Perrin Air Force Base had F-102s, F-86s, T-33s, and every year they had an air show. And from my earliest memory until I went to college, I went to all their air shows. And I even, about age 10 or so, got to fly the simulator for the F-102. Anyway, I was spitting. I tell the story, and it's kind of sounds funny, but during these air shows, they let us on the flight line, and I always like to sniff the exhaust of the jet engines, and it has a very distinctive smell, and it's a smell that I really liked, and that just stayed with me. And my dad was kind of a lower middle class type. He was a mail clerk, and so we didn't have a lot of money, and my parents did not like flying. Anytime that they went for a commercial flight, they had to take tranquilizers. And I'm not sure where I got the absolute love for flying, but it was there nevertheless. And then my parents were very good in that they didn't try to talk me out of it. They knew that when I went to college, I wanted to go to a college where they had Air Force ROTC, sorry, the Reserve Officers Training Program. So I was in ROTC for 4 years. And then when I graduated, I went into the Air Force. So that's how I got the love of flying. I had a stumbling block my junior year in college because I flunked the physical to be a pilot. It was my eyes. I had 20/25 eyes, and they insisted on it being 20/20. And so I went to my professor of air science and almost crying and said, I've been eliminated from pilot training. What can I do to get back in pilot training? And he told me that the only way that I could make that happen, if at all, was to go to graduate school. And while I was at graduate school, do eye exercises, see an ophthalmologist, optometrist, anybody, and try to get my eyes back to that, back to 20/20. So I did that. I went to graduate school. Now, the funny thing about that is that he said, well, you can go to navigator school. And I looked at him and I said, sir, I do not want to be a navigator. Well, the professor of air science was a navigator. And he was had a very good attitude about that. He says, well, I understand what you're talking about because it happened to him too. He wanted to be a pilot and he flunked the physical and he had to be a navigator. So I went to graduate school, and during that time I went to eye doctors and specialists and found out about this new fangled thing. This was in 1964, about hard contact lenses. So I got outfitted with hard contact lenses, and it took me about a year to notice that when I took them out and waited about at least 12 hours that my eyes were better than 20/20. I could see very, very well. So I played that game, and when I discovered that, it was just about the time for me to get my master's degree. If that had happened the first year, I would have left. I wouldn't have gone to graduate school, but I did, and so I simultaneously got my master's degree and then went to the nearest Air Force base, which was in Fort Worth, Texas, and applied to go on active duty, which I was accepted, and I was accepted into pilot training. I was so happy to get into pilot training, and it was truly the best year of my professional life to do that, because everything was new. It was exactly what I wanted to do. We were flying T-38 supersonic and flying formation and navigation, low level, and I just loved all that. But I was not disciplined properly. So I studied enough to get by, and I was just concentrating on having fun. And so I finished about the middle of my class. And it's not that I didn't get what I wanted, because I would have taken anything out of pilot training, any airplane. So I was assigned then as a co-pilot in the KC-135. And I did that for almost 3 years up at the northern base of Kinchlow Air Force Base, which is right on the Canadian border. Weather that I was not accustomed to living in Texas. First winter, we had 140 inches of snow accumulate, and they had to snow plow everything, and it was kind of a miserable existence for someone who was used to Texas. Anyway, after that, then that's just when the Vietnam War was going pretty heavy. So anybody who was a pilot was going to have to cycle through the Vietnam. So after I'd been there maybe 2.5 years, I got orders to Vietnam and flying C-130s. So I flew C-130s there for a year. And during that time, my goal in the Air Force was to fly as many airplanes as possible and to go to the test pilot school if I could. And that's really the only reason that I majored in mathematics, was because to go to test pilot school, you had to have a science or math degree. And if I had done what I wanted to do, I would have probably majored in history, because I love history. And that's especially why I liked going to England. My favorite off-station place where we stayed a long time was Mildenhall. And the time at Mildenhall, we might fly once or twice a week. The rest of the time, we had rental cars, and I toured the country. I went from Scotland all the way down to the English Channel, and looking at castles and everything, which is fascinated with your country. So see, where was I? Oh yeah, when I was in Vietnam, then I didn't particularly want to go back to tankers, and I didn't particularly want to go back to C-130s. And during that time, if nothing else happened, that's exactly what would have happened. So I thought, well, if I can't do something different, then I'd like to try my luck with the airlines. So I put in a request to get out of the Air Force while simultaneously applying for about 4 special assignments in the Air Force and U.S. Air Force. At every personnel center, there is a document kept that's called special assignments, and the SR-71 was one of those. Flying the F-104 was another, flying the F-106 was another, and there were all these special deals that you could apply for separately, apart from the normal military personnel center assignments. So I applied to about 4 of them, and one of them was B-57 at Albuquerque. It was it was actually nuclear sampling and taking pictures of things. And it was a reconnaissance. And they had the RB-57F, which was a 4-engine high altitude reconnaissance vehicle that's NASA is still flying. They have 4 of them flying. And so I applied for that, and to my surprise, I was selected for that. And so I had that assignment, and then I also had the request to get out of the Air Force simultaneously. So I had to hurry real quick and take out that request to be separated from the Air Force. So that went through okay. And so from there, I went to the B-57 at Albuquerque. And then within a year, I transitioned to the RB-57F, which again is I don't know if you're familiar with, they only made about 18 of them. And its primary job was to sample nuclear fallout. It was built during the time before the nuclear test ban treaty, when everybody was arcing off nuclear weapons, and there was a lot of publicity about the fallout and nuclear clouds going around the earth and so forth. So we did that, and then I'm really condensing a lot here, but after serving 3 years, we got word that the squadron was going to close. In fact, I had the duty of flying the first of the RB-57Fs to the Boneyard in Arizona. And so I applied for the United States Air Force Test Pilot School then. And owing to the fact that I was checked out in the KC-135 and the C-130, had a combat tour, flew the Short Wing 57, the Canberra, and also flew the reconnaissance version, and was a young captain. I had a good resume to go to the test pilot school. So I did that. I went to Edwards and stayed there for 4 years, 73 through 76. And went through the test pilot school and then became a test pilot. And I was a test pilot. I flew the F-104, the U-2, and the KC-135 and the T-38. We could, test pilots, to my surprise and delight, can be simultaneously checked out in as many airplanes as you can handle, I suppose. So I flew those. And then as soon as I had the minimum time at Edwards, I applied to fly the SR-71 and was accepted in that program in 1976. And then I stayed in that program for 11 years. So that was half of my military career. I was in the SR-71. I first flew reconnaissance flights from 77 to 84. And then in 84, I went to Edwards again to be a test pilot in the SR-71. During the SR-71's program, there were always 2 test pilots assigned to Edwards to fly the new equipment or new systems that were put in the airplane. At the time that I was doing it, we completely revamped the flight control system, changed it from analog to digital. And then at the end of that program, then we were changing the entire electrical system. Plus, we added other things along the line. Most of the things that they added in the SR-71 were the sensors and not pilot-related items. The cockpit of the airplane never looked much different than it did when it came off the assembly line. So that's how I got interested in flying. And after that, there's a story attached to it, but I won't go through it all. I worked for Northrop for almost a year and a half as a flight test engineer, with the hopes of being a test pilot in the B-2. So I was in the first ground school for the B-2, and my job at the B-2 at the Northrop was to come up with the flight test plan for the instrumentation airplane, which was the number 3 B-2. Then after I'd been at Northrop for about a year, Northrop had lost the stealth fighter program against Lockheed. So Lockheed stealth fighter was the one that was adopted. So when Lockheed lost, then they had 3 or 4 test pilots on that program who had more seniority than I did. They came into the B-2 program because they didn't have a job. So I could see that in the pecking order, I just went back three people. And I figured that if I got to fly, it was going to be years from then. And I did not like having a desk job. The flight test engineer, I was in a cubicle with another engineer, and doing the flight test planning was okay, but it wasn't cockpit and it wasn't flying. So I cast my net out and then got a job with United Airlines. United Airlines, as a test pilot, United Airlines is a one airline, I don't know of any other, that hire professional test pilots to take care of all of the extraneous flights that are necessary with an airline. And those flights are first flight out of heavy maintenance, engine out ferries when we had 3 and 4 engine airplanes. If a pilot wrote up a problem on his airplane, which could not be duplicated on the ground, then we would take it up and duplicate it in the air. We would also, when United bought airplanes, like from Boeing or Airbus, we would actually go to the plants and be the first United pilots to fly and make the acceptance for the new airplanes. And then the old airplanes that were out of service, then we would fly those to wherever their base was to be disposed. There's I don't know if you looked at my YouTube channel, there's one YouTube video of my landing at Meigs Field in Chicago, which is a very short runway. They wanted a 727, which is the first one that United had, to go into their Museum of Science and Industry. So I had the task of landing that 727 on a 3,000, I think it was 3,200 foot runway. After that, after I turned 60, then I worked at United until I turned 60. And then I taught high school math for 3 years. And I was thinking, well, gosh, this is going to be kind of a nice retirement job. Turned out to be the hardest thing I've ever done in my life. Seriously. I was not cut out to stand on my feet talking algebra 2 for 6 hours a day, and then having 100 papers to grade. that was what it was, and it was difficult. So after that, and I taught high school math as a volunteer for the juvenile detention facility, which is, the place where they incarcerate juveniles who have to go to high school. But so they offer high school classes. So I taught that. The biggest problem I had teaching was classroom discipline. I taught in an all boys school. And it turns out that when you teach all boys, they're always in competition with one another to make their teacher's life miserable. And but at the juvenile detention facility, we had guards there, so there wasn't a discipline problem at all. Okay, that's a thumbnail sketch of my life. So, you have anything else there? Any other question? Hello? Am I the only one talking?
It takes us a while to get going.
Huh?
It takes us a while to get going, and when we do,
Okay.
the questions all sort of come.
All right.
We also have to remember to unmute as well. But,
Did I talk too much?
No, that was
not at all.
great.
No, but that's interesting.
One thing I noticed is that kind of a funny thing about this discipline thing. When I was in pilot training, I just that was the best year of my life, seriously. And when I got to be a co-pilot in the KC-135, I learned a lot, and I'm glad that I was a co-pilot. And if I had gone directly into F-105s or something like that, that would have been a different story. And the aircraft commander I had been there a while, and he taught me a lot. He taught me, I probably learned to fly about half as much just being a co-pilot, watching him. And then he always let me fly, half of the missions as though I were the captain or pilot in command. And we went to Southeast Asia to refuel the fighters in Vietnam. And my attitude at that time going in there was, yeah, let's fly a mission or so, and then let's go to the bar and have fun. Well, he volunteered. He never asked us, whether myself and a navigator and a boom operator, we were all an integral crew, and we did everything together. He never asked us our opinion about how much we fly or anything. He just went there and says and scheduled us, or he volunteered to fly. So sometimes we flew 3 times a day, and that was tough flying. It was hot and everything, but he said that's our job, and we're in the military, and we're going to do a good job, and you go to the bar after you're exhausted, more or less. And I started taking that to heart. And he also said, that he told me I was not disciplined enough. That I was more interested in having a good time than in being serious about my work. So I took that to heart too. The guy was wonderful. And I started, like, for instance, I would read portions of the flight manual every day. Just take an hour out and read the flight manual, read the hydraulic system, read the pneumatic system, read the fuel system, read the regulations and everything. I decided in my mind that I wanted to be the go-to guy, at least for co-pilots, if they had a question about any of the systems. And that really worked. And I didn't know what people were saying about me at the time, but about 2 years into that program, I was selected to be the wing commander's co-pilot when he took check rides, which is, for a co-pilot, you can't get any better than that. So I flew with the wing commander then, flew in the airplane, and then every time he had a check ride or a simulator, I was his co-pilot. And that just that little tiny thing, which doesn't sound like it would be much, in the scheme of things, it really meant a lot to me, and it encouraged me to be exactly that, to be the go-to guy. If someone has a question about one of the systems or something, hey, go ask BC. And I think that is the reason why I became an SR-71 pilot, was because of that attitude. Now, if I'd gone to a military academy, that probably would have been beat into me. I would have had that attitude before, but it took somebody to do a heart-to-heart talk with me about, know your priorities.
Bredette, it's Kevin here. Any sort of hairy moments that you're able to tell us about?
Well, someone asked me one time.
I know you don't always like talking about those sort of things, but there must be some interesting incidents that you've encountered in your illustrious career.
Well, yeah, certainly. Yeah, I've only met 2 other pilots who never had a staff job in the Air Force. And I was one of them. That was my goal, was to fly as many airplanes as I could and not have a staff job. Anyway, so yes, I've lost engines, and I guess the most critical thing I'd ever done. Now, the thing is that someone asked me if I've ever been scared, and the answer is no. And I know the reason why is because I've never been out of control. I've always been in control of the airplane. So if I were out of control, I'm not sure how I'd react. I guess I'd be panicked or something, if I had an ejection seat or something, but I just never got to that. The most that I was concerned about one time was at Mildenhall. And I'd come in from a operational mission, and the weather had turned really bad, as it wants to do sometimes. And it was about 100 and a quarter, 100 and a half ceiling and visibility. Well, it was way below minimums, but I had no choice. I had to come in. I was low on gas, and you can't just go up and do a go around. I mean, a couple of 1,000 pounds of fuel every time you make a low pass. I'll give you an example. From the time that you start engines until you take off, you burn almost 10,000 pounds of gas. The thing was a gas eater. So here I am coming in. They said it's below minimums. That's, don't have any choice when we come in. So I broke out and I was just a little bit offset from the runway. And I did a humongous turn, just run like this. Our supervisor of flying, the SR-71 ops officer, was in the towers. They always were. And he thought I'd crashed. He really, because he lost sight of me when I did this swap thing. And he said he had been the happiest in his life when he saw the drag chute blossom. That's the first thing he saw, was a drag chute come out. But it was one of those things that I wasn't sure I had enough fuel to go around and do another one. I would have if I didn't see the runway, but that breaking out like that, I've never crashed or anything. So I guess that would be the answer to that question.
You're lucky. Well done. Thank you.
Oh, there was a time also that it got my, it was only a momentary thing, but I was doing a reconnaissance mission around North Korea. And I remember I was going west to east along the demilitarized zone. And this was at night. And all of a sudden, this big fireball comes by me, going faster than I'm going. I'm going 2,000 miles an hour. So this thing goes past me, goes down below me, and it explodes. And it turned out it was a meteor. I don't know how close it was to me because of, you can't tell distance when you don't have anything to compare it to. But I was convinced that was a surface-to-air missile. What else would be out there? And that what surprised me is that we didn't have an indication of it, because we were told that if they were about to launch a surface-to-air missile, we would know about it and we could go into our defensive procedures. Well, I didn't.
That's a very unusual experience, I imagine.
Yeah, it was. I mean, it was just for a moment. It was, hard on the throat type experience. Another interesting thing that I saw was I was flying from California to England, and I just refueled off of Newfoundland, and I'd already reached up to Mach 3, and we went in the vicinity of the Aurora Borealis, the Northern Lights. And I looked up in the characteristics of the Northern Lights, and they said that it didn't come down to 85,000 feet where I was, but it looked like it was there. It looked like I was flying through it, and it was shimmering. And I'm going 2,000 miles an hour. The lights were coming in from this direction, and they were green and white and blue and red and just shimmering. And I was going through them real fast. It was the most spectacular thing I've ever seen in my life. And of course, I didn't have a movie camera or anything with me. I would have loved that. I told my back seater, and the poor back seater only has windows up here. He can only see out, and he saw a little bit, but he didn't see what I saw. I saw the specter of the Northern Lights. Absolutely beautiful.
Fantastic.
But
That
Dan,
had to be incredible.
when you flew through that, did the radio frequencies or the high intensity radio stuff affect any of your instrumentation?
No, it sure didn't. No. I
Um,
understand that phenomenon is not very strong. I read about it, and it says that the ceiling or the bottom of the Northern Lights is around 90,000 or 100,000, something like that. It was above where I was, but it didn't look like it. It looked like I was going through them. But we didn't talk on radios anyway there, and the instruments, no, it didn't affect them.
when you were flying the RB-57, did you ever get a chance to fly a British Canberra?
No, not the British. We flew B-57Cs. That was a clamshell canopy, two people in it. So no, we didn't fly. Of course, it was made from the Canberra.
And did you sort of exchange ideas, information, experiences with the British guys at all?
No. It was just strictly just the US IPs, instructor pilots.
Thank you.
Bredette, the U-2, sort of stories that it was difficult to fly. Is there any truth in that? Or
Well,
difficult to land,
yeah,
perhaps, was
it
the
was difficult to land, yes. It had a 15-knot crosswind limit, and you could exceed that, but it would require putting one wingtip on the runway.
so it depends how fast the guys would run either side of the wing. Is that right?
Well, they wouldn't be at the airplane at the moment of touchdown.
I realise that. I'm joking.
Well, the U-2, has a skid on it on the wingtips, and the bottom of the skid is a titanium plate, so it's made to be dragged on the runway, and the only problem with it is that if you drag your left wing on the runway, then you're going to be turning left, because the only nose wheel, or the only steering you have is the tail wheel, and there's not much authority with the tail wheel. It takes a big radius to turn that airplane around. There are many times that we always have a ground crew meet us, because the idea of the pilot is supposed to balance the fuel as precisely as the pilot can when he's on downwind for the last landing. And there was a little indicator up on the yoke. This indicator had like this, and you could transfer fuel from one tank to the other, and try to get the thing very centered with your hands off and get it nice and centered. And then the task of the pilot then is to land and keep the wings off the ground as long as possible. And if you had a 15-knot crosswind,
That would be difficult.
This balancing act on the runway.
Yeah, I can imagine. Yeah.
Keep the wings up. If you didn't have a 15-knot headwind, you're going to land, one wing is going to touch the runway. Well, that's when the crew comes out. And then the crew, now when you do that, the wing is down, and the fuel runs into this side. And so it's sometimes hard to right the airplane up. But they do that. They balance it, and then they put the auxiliary gear, they call them the pogos, and now you can taxi. The pilot can taxi. If you have a strong wind, then the wind could prevent you from turning, because the authority of the tail wheel steering is quite limited.
Yeah.
So in that case, you'd have to have the ground crew actually, they pull one wing and push the other, and they actually turn the airplane physically. Now that's what you do to, like, for instance, to get off the runway if you're going to a taxiway that was fairly narrow.
Interesting. Yeah.
But now, as far as flying the airplane, it was, I think it climbed at 165 knots. So the problems that come with high speed are not with the U-2. Now, what you don't want to do is to jerk it off the ground, because the fuel is carried in a sump tank in the fuselage, but most of the fuel is out on the wing. The wing is long and it's flexible. And if you take off fully loaded and you rack it up, go pull back real hard, you could do some damage to the wing,
Sure.
which is done before. So you have to be, it's a delicate airplane. The SR-71 was delicate when it was flying at 2,000 miles an hour. And I can tell you why later if you want to know. But the U-2 was just delicate all the time. And so you could climb at 165, you could climb 30 degrees of pitch. And it's quite powerful, lots of thrust to weight. Then when you get up to above 60,000 feet, at least I only flew the AD, C, and F models. I was one of the last pilots to check out in the A model, the OJ57 engine. And now I don't know about the present U-2. The present U-2, they used to be Q models. I think they're up to S or something now. And that's a different airplane, completely different airplane. And I don't know anything about the characteristics of that, but the original U-2 had a lot of compromise built into it. When you got up to 60,000 feet, you had just a few knots between mock buffet and stall. And the reason is for that is that as you climb up, the speed of sound is closer to your cruise speed.
Yeah.
And it's certainly a subsonic airplane. Now, that's the bad news, is that you might have 15 knots or so between mock buffet and stall. So you have to fly within 7 knots or so of your speed.
It's a heavy workload, isn't it?
Well, you have an autopilot, and I have flown missions in the U-2, long missions, 4-hour missions, without an autopilot. That is hit workload. But the autopilot was good when it worked, and one could set the power and be assured that you're not going to go too far away. But the good news about this, they call it the coffin corner, which is really misnomered, is that if you went into mock buffet, not much happened. The airplane would shake and the nose would tend to go down. Well, you have plenty of control authority to bring the nose up. If you run out of that authority, there's a little device called the gust control. You hit that switch and you're going to go up. That's what it was built for. And then lowering the gear would be you have speed brakes, and then you could lower the gear at any time. So you had all those things working for you in the high speed. In the low speed region, if you stalled the airplane, you just lower the nose and recover. There's not a tendency to spin or anything like that, unless you cram the rudder, which only a suicidal maniac would do. So both the high speed and the stall were rather benign, so there wasn't a problem there. But I mean, if you just let it go, then now you got a problem, because the high speed buffet will cause a pitch down, and of course, the pitch down, you'll be increasing your speed, and you'll get more mock buffet, and you'll get after a while you'll get out of control.
And I guess U-2 and SR-71 are like chalk and cheese, as we say here.
I'm not sure the meaning of that.
You're very, very sedate in the U-2, but pretty rapid in the SR.
Well, the SR had its own problems. And
what was your typical sortie length in the respective aircraft?
Well, in the U-2, I didn't fly reconnaissance missions in the U-2. I was a test pilot, and we tested some of the equipment, film, cameras, listening devices, and all that kind of stuff. So my longest flight was 12 hours, where I took off from California, went up to Minnesota. Why, I don't know, but a lot of these things were classified, and I didn't know what I was doing, but I did, they said, here, hit that switch, take pictures of this, and so I did my own flight planning. But what the information that I brought back was used for, I have no idea. Didn't want to know either. So went up to Minnesota and did some photography, and then came back, and that was 12 hours is a long time.
A long time.
They routinely fly 12-hour missions out of England. My longest flight in the SR-71 was 10.5 hours, and that was long enough. And the workload is higher in the SR, of course. But the one disadvantage, and I found it to be a disadvantage, is that you could not say to the back seater about hour 8, gee, I'm getting tired, my ass hurts, or something like that. And there is something to be said for a sympathetic ear when you're doing that.
A problem shared.
Yes, problem shared.
Would you say if there's ever been a challenging moment in your career, something that's been quite challenging?
Well, I always say, I have never been bored in an airplane, and the supplement to that statement, I guess, would be every flight is challenging. Flying the SR-71 the way it should be flown was challenging. I mean, really challenging. Again, I had an autopilot to help me out, but loss of an autopilot was not necessarily a reason to stop the mission. To fly the SR-71 with stability augmentation, but without autopilot, was doable. But my gosh, it would cut down on your cross-check because you'd be primarily focused on attitude and speed if you lost your autopilot. You all that fly, know what vertical speed is like and all that. But if you going 2,000 miles an hour, if you deviate 1 degree from your pitch attitude, that will give you 3,000 foot per minute rate of climb or descent. So at that speed, the SR-71's G limit is 1.5 Gs. Well, 1.5 Gs is not much. It's a 45-degree bank turn. Or if you're flying and you start this kind of stuff, you could exceed that real quick. So that was the biggest problem, was just if you didn't have an autopilot to maintain attitude. The autopilot that we did have in the SR was an attitude hold, and Mach. They also had Mach hold, but the primary function was attitude hold. It did not have altitude hold, because altitude hold is not something you want to do. You always want to keep climbing as the fuel burns off. And we had a checklist that was about this thick that was on my left leg. And you could look up and say, depending on your outside air temperature, your gross weight, and your speed, and your configuration, which was always the same, but not always, then you could choose that altitude. It would give you the proper altitude. And outside air temperature was a big factor. A couple of degrees off standard could mean the difference between having your bingo fuel at the end of your sortie or not.
So what sort of time frame could you operate at maximum speed? Presumably not the whole mission, but presumably there must be a dash period where you accelerate and hold at whatever the max speed was on the mission.
Well, you could go a couple of 1,000 miles on one tank of gas and still refuel. And we refueled about every hour and a half.
Yeah,
on average. When the world speed record was set coast to coast, that was one tank of gas. And he started, I don't know if you've read about this, but Ed Yielding, good friend of mine, I was his instructor pilot. Don't tell him I said this, but I taught him everything he knows. He flew that flight, and of course, you imagine it's a big deal. It was when the program was canceled, and our test airplane, which people ask me what's the best SR-71, it's the one at the Smithsonian is the best airplane. It was our test airplane, and it had all the good stuff on it, all the new stuff. That was anything that was new was going to be tested on that airplane first, a 972. And you can imagine the pressure on the pilot. He's going to deliver this airplane to the Smithsonian, and it's either going to go in one flight or it's going to go in several flights. But if you go in one flight, you're going to set the world speed record from coast to coast. I mean, it'd be easy to do that. And also if he had broken the speed limits, the airplane would have done it in under an hour. But the way that the course was laid out, I think it was an hour and 4 minutes is what his record is from the West Coast to Washington. And I think, and then Washington, then he went on another few miles just to do the coast to coast thing. But he wanted to do it in under an hour, and he talked to Lockheed about it. Lockheed said, well, yeah, the airplane can do it, but you're going to be put in a situation where if you have an unstart and you're in a turn, and some of the things, the airplane could go out of control. So he elected not to do that. Mach 3.3 was the maximum Mach that we were, by the flight manual rules, were allowed to go. But we're never power limited. The afterburner range was about like this, and our cruise was about like this. So we had this much more throttle left that we could have gone. We could have easily gone to Mach 3.5. However, the inlet stopped scheduling at Mach 3.25. And if they stop scheduling, then you're closer to an unstart. And the inlets are not as effective, or it's not as efficient. So you're going to start picking up drag. And I'm not sure, no one ever went to full afterburner to see how fast it would go. I mean, that'd be really stupid. So they said, well, you could go to Mach 3.5. However, all these bad things may happen, and you'll over temp the airplane, because usually our limiting factor was not only the Mach, but the Mach and the temperature limit coincided. There's an interesting story there. Our top limit was 427 degrees centigrade for the inlet compressor temperature.
That's
So
hot.
427, that's a weirdly weird number. Well, it was Pratt and Whitney, being an American thing, put the limit as 800 degrees Fahrenheit. Well, 800 degrees Fahrenheit is 427 degrees centigrade, and the gauge was in centigrade. So we had to memorize 427, which I've never forgotten. And I think every pilot, you ask them, what's the heat limit, they would tell you 427. But 800 would be easier to memorize.
Have you any idea why the gauge was in centigrade, being an American airplane?
Well, those things happen, the famous example of one of the satellites that orbited Mars. Are you familiar with that?
No.
One engineer gave gave the results in meters, the other gave it in feet, and the two got crossed up, and the thing crashed.
Gosh.
People often say that, you must have flown more than one SR-71. Were there any differences between the examples that you flew, sort of little quirks with some of them? No two are exactly the same, are they?
That is correct. Yes, they were. They were all, they say hand built. Well, yes, they were hand built. The parts on the airplane were specific for that airplane, because you couldn't just take a panel off of one airplane, put it on the other.
Wouldn't fit another one, yeah.
It may not, because the airplane stretches in flight and everything. And just, it's a engineering nightmare and a maintenance nightmare. One of the remarkable things about the SR-71 is that they had 19 to 22-year-old guys working on that, and they were good. I never had I had write-ups and everything, but in my 1,217.3 hours, I never had an engine write-up. I never wrote up the engine. I lost oil sometimes, but the engine never quit. Never. It always worked well. And now other guys had different problems, but it was well put together. And it was the only airplane in the Air Force I know that would not accept a delayed discrepancy. If there was something wrong with the airplane, it had to be fixed before the next flight. Because sometimes there's a cascade of problems.
Sure.
If you lose a generator, you also lose, you don't lose your boost pumps, but if you lost a second generator, you've just crashed the airplane. It's not too many airplanes that will crash if you lose your generators, because you have battery backup. And in fact, we had 2 battery backups, but you needed AC power to run the boost pumps for the fuel, because the engine required a lot of pressure. And if you lost 2 generators, you didn't have any AC power for the boost pumps, and that was flight tested. It crashed. I feel like I'm not answering questions directly. What was your question again?
my question.
Yes.
I've
Did I
forgotten, I've forgotten now. What I've got another question. I mean, you mentioned the maintenance guys. I mean, what presumably the maintenance to flight hour ratio must have been pretty extensive. In other words, how many hours of maintenance to keep it in the air for an hour?
Yeah, I don't really know that.
Well, you probably wouldn't know that, would you? I guess.
It took about 24 hours to do a quick turn.
Mm.
Whereas when you land, the airplane is grounded for 24 hours until
It sounds as if it's quite a reliable aircraft from what you're saying, though.
Well, yeah, we had a checklist for everything, and the mission checklist or the aircraft checklist is about this thick. Incidentally, I think that checklist is on line. If you Google SR-71 flight manual or something like that, you'll get that, and you can see what I'm talking about. But part of the mission checklist was what we call a go, no go checklist. And that is, if you have a problem, then it directs you, military order, to do something. And I'll give you an example of that. I had the honor, the benefit to make the first landing in continental Europe at Buda, Norway. And what happened was we were on a mission from California up to Murmansk to photograph the sub pins there and take a look at the nuclear missiles, and then fly back to California. So round robin, California to California by way of Murmansk. It's a 10.5-hour mission. And I was already gone by Murmansk and was coming back, and we were refueling about 60 miles off the Norwegian coast in the Norwegian Sea. And I was on the tanker, and then I got this red light. And the red light is always an emergency light. We have two, yellow and red. Yellow is cautionary, red is emergency. So I disconnected and looked, and it was low oil quantity. It's low oil quantities, which means I had an oil leak. Well, we look in the checklist, and I knew what it was, but it's land as soon as possible. And that takes the decision away from the pilot. If I did not have that checklist and I just saw an indication of maybe a leak, I would have struggled to Mildenhall, which is was our abort base from that, because Mildenhall is British people, English people, and used to handling the airplane, and we had our own hangar there and everything. So it was the better place to land.
And you got the JP7 there.
Yeah, I think so. But anyway, our orders there says land as soon as possible. Well, that meant I did not have a choice. So the reason they instituted that procedure was that we used to have two trainers, two SR-71Bs, and they were on a flight, and they lost one generator, and they were like over Arizona or something. And so they elected to come back to Beale Air Force Base to land. Well, we only lost one generator, no big deal. Well, on short final at Beale, they lost a second generator, and the airplane crashed, within 30 seconds or so. And all the engines quit, and it's time to leave. So as a result of that, because military pilots, and I'm sure want to complete the mission. And if it's at all possible to complete the mission, that's what we're going to do, especially SR-71 reconnaissance, where people are looking for this important stuff. At least we thought it was important. I think it was. And yeah, I definitely would have pressed on with that light if it wasn't told to land. Now, I said that because you asked me about the reliability. Part of the reason why we had, no military pilot was ever killed in the SR-71. We had a lot of, not a lot, we had people bail out, and land with one engine out and fire and all that kind of stuff. But nobody was ever killed in one. And we owed it to two factors. One was our training. Our training was the most complete and exact training of any Air Force aircraft, I believe. And it took about a year to walk on base, and about a year later, you were qualified to fly your first training flight. And all that time was devoted to reading the Dash 1 and taking tests and simulators and ground school. A lot of it. And then based on that, also the maintenance. The maintenance guys were. You talk about dedication. They're still that way. They are so gung ho about what they did. They were proud to be associated with the fastest, highest flying airplane in the world. They were proud to be associated with the strategic reconnaissance mission, and we encouraged that. There was a lot of communication between the maintenance and the mission exploiters, the people who read our camera film. I tell the story, and it's true, that my very first operational flight, and maybe the first two or three, I flew it as the exactly the way the flight manual said, and it says when you are on the reconnaissance run taking pictures that you're supposed to be on autopilot. So I just put on autopilot and let it go. Well, I had I think it was a staff sergeant. Now here I am, a major, and a staff sergeant comes up to me and says, "Sir, your pictures are fuzzy, and the others aren't." No. Well, good heavens. What do you mean my pictures are fuzzy? So he critiques me. He says, "Well, what are you doing when you're taking pictures?" "Nothing. I'm on autopilot." "No, what you're supposed to do is to hold the stick and make sure it doesn't wobble, because a little wobble at 2,000 miles an hour is a big swath." I mean, it's still readable, but still, it's not good. And so I thanked him very much, and that's the type of communication that we had. That was a good example of the type of communication. The people that maintained our pressure suits, for instance, they knew that if they messed up, that we could die easily. All you have to do is lose cabin pressurization, and a second later, the pilot is incapacitated and dead because your blood would start boiling. We flew in the most dangerous, most unforgiving flight environment. We were going so fast that if you stuck your hand out the window, you'd be experiencing 620 degrees Fahrenheit. It'd be like sticking your hand in a blast furnace, literally. That's hotter than your oven on the cleaning cycle. And you can imagine what the problems are flying in an environment like that. And then you add to that the dynamic pressure, the fact that there are shock waves all over that airplane. Who knows where they are, between those shock waves. And the outside air pressure is about 1/4 of 1 pound per square inch. I use pounds per square inch because I'm used to that. But here at sea level, and I'm basically at sea level, it's about 15 pounds per square inch, and up there it's about between 1/4 and 1/2. There's just virtually no air up there, and that's the reason why the SR-71 can go so fast. Is that you have to go that fast to get enough air for the engine to work.
Interesting.
So, and if you lose pressurization, and so okay, that when you're at that altitude and speed, your biggest problem is not fuel, because you got fuel, but the biggest problem is pressurization and heat. We had 2 independent air conditioners, either of which would put out enough cooling air to keep us alive. But I lost one air conditioning pack one time, and the cockpit heated up to about 130 degrees. It was so hot in the cockpit that I had a tough time with the garden gloves. And this is what our gloves look like. Even with these thick gloves, the control stick was really too hot to keep my hand on it. So you got the heat problem, and then you have the pressurization. And if you lost cabin pressure, and I don't know that anyone ever lost cabin pressure in the SR-71. There was one time a guy foolishly didn't pressurize the cabin. That was another story though. And but if you had a sudden rapid decompression, that suit had to work. I mean, it had to work not in 1 second, but it had to work immediately.
It's a remarkable machine considering when it was designed. I mean, it's old technology, but I mean, it was way ahead of its time, really, wasn't it?
Yes, it was. Certainly was.
Yeah.
You mentioned about going to Murmansk as a sort of a mission profile. If you were visiting the same place on a regular basis, and probably you can't talk too much of where you did go, did you spend? Oh, you can.
Yeah,
so if
say this, there's nothing classified about the SR-71 anymore, including where we flew. The only thing classified are the defensive equipment, the specifications, and some of the sensors that we carried. Now, having said that, I'll say I don't know what that is either. If I did not have to know something classified, now at the time that I flew, even our takeoff time was classified. So we were inundated with classified material, and like where we flew, the speed we flew, the things I just told you today, all that stuff was secret. But now I can tell you anything I know because I don't know the specifications of the defensive system or what the cameras were capable of. And we had several. We had 3 different types of camera, including a radar camera that would operate day, night, weather, not, so forth.
So if you were going to Murmansk as an example, and you were going there regularly because there was something of interest, would you have the same amount of mission planning before the flight, or would it become a bit sort of like standard, if that makes sense, or would you still spend, I don't know, X amount of hours planning before the departure?
Good question. And the answer is we would spend as much time as we needed to know what was going on. The political scene would change. The weather at our alternates would change. So we had my biggest concern was alternates and what to do if. And the if is, fire, have to land now, friendly countries and so forth. I don't know whether I should say some of the countries we were forbidden to land, but I was surprised at some of the countries that we could not land. And I mean, if we had no choice, we would bail out of the airplane before we would land there. I guess I better not say that, but the political thing changed. For instance, when President Reagan was, when President Ford was president, we overflew Cuba. When President Carter came into office, about a week later, we stopped overflying Cuba and we flew around Cuba. And so if we were in the southern part of going around Cuba and we lost an engine or something, and we were just going Mach 3, the easiest and quickest way to get on the ground would be to overfly Cuba 90 degrees and go to Key West, Florida. But we told we couldn't do that. We could never overfly Cuba. So we had to do that. If we lost an engine, thank goodness nobody ever did, we would have to go in the Southern Caribbean, very vulnerable. We'd be, going 0.8 Mach at 25,000 feet or so without that engine. And I don't know what kind of fighters Cuba had at the time, but any of them could have shot us down easy, and they would have. So it was that type of thing. We didn't have full control of where we could go or what we could do. So we had to study that, and that changed from time to time. Say there was one country that we couldn't land, and that really surprised me. Well, why not? Well, I didn't know the answer to that. All I know is you can't land there.
I won't put you on the spot and ask you to name it, but I would say it's probably France. So,
No,
so,
it wasn't France. We could land at any NATO country.
okay.
You leave me out of this.
Sorry.
No, NATO was certainly, we could land at any of that. I mean,
What about
Well-
Brazil? But you couldn't have gone there.
well, we didn't fly in South America. The only place, the only time the SR-71 went south of the equator was out of Diego Garcia. And that was to cover Iran, I think.
Can you shed light on any of the countries that you couldn't have gone to, or was that a?
Well, I don't want to say the ones we don't. It might be embarrassing to present government or something. I don't know.
I thought I'd ask a cheeky question, but there we go. There's another one I was going to ask, which I usually ask after the other one. Obviously, I asked you about the challenging. I usually ask what would you say your career highlight was out of flying? Something that really stood out for you.
Well, I think the most important mission I ever flew was what we call the North Korea trolling mission. Have you heard of that? It's been written up in a few books. I've got some notes on that. I thought you might ask them question. The North Korea trolling mission was October 26, 1981. It started with a flight that I made on November 13th, 1980. This is a mission against North Korea. And North Koreans took umbrage with this. Now this is November the 13th, 1980 was my birthday. So I remember this flight very well. And then we got this message, this classified message from North Korea. It's kind of funny. It wasn't addressed to us, but I don't know who it was addressed to, but it was, and I'll just read the message to you. It says, the U.S. imperialist aggression forces, which are now hastening preparations for a war, frantically kicking up war dust against the northern half of the republic. They say northern half because they claim all of Korea. Committed a military provocation by infiltrating an SR-71 high-speed, high-altitude reconnaissance plane at 12:23 on November 13th, deep into the air above the coastal sea of our country. While raising a hue and cry, I love all these words. I mean, they're so communist, you know. While raising a hue and cry over a fictitious threat from the north these days, the U.S. imperialists perpetuate military provocations more frequently against our people, zealously encouraging the military fascist gangsters to an anti-communist smear campaign. After September the 4th alone, the United States has infiltrated spy planes on 36 occasions into the air above our territorial waters and coastal sea of our country. It's a challenge to peace in Korea and her peaceful reunification, and a dangerous act jeopardizing the peace of Asia and the rest of the world. I go on, it goes on like that. So when we got this, you know, I was at Okinawa at the time, and it called for a round of cheer. It was funny. And I love all those communist slogans, you know, kicking up clouds of war dust. Now that was a good one. President Reagan had just been elected president, but he hadn't taken office yet. Then fast forward to August of 1981. Now they issued these things periodically, you know, the North Koreans, and we would always get them. At the time, they were classified. I don't know why, but we got them, and now they're not classified anymore. On August 25th, 1981, my good friend Maury Rosenberg and Edie McKim were flying along the DMZ between North and South Korea, and they encountered the last known surface-to-air attack on an SR-71. I was in England when that happened, and we were somewhat concerned about it, because not for our own safety, because I never felt, well, I mean, we were threatened if someone's trying to shoot at you, but I never felt like they could hit us, because warning and our defensive systems were good and had been proven time and time again. So as long as we knew it was coming, I think we could get out of the way. Can you imagine you have a surface-to-air missile with fins this big, accelerating, going up, trying to intercept the SR-71. We know about it. So we simultaneously jam the guidance. We accelerate, because we never flew at maximum Mach, accelerate, climb, and turn with 45 degrees of bank. Try that missile out turning us and knowing where we're going. It just didn't happen, I don't think. They would have to know exactly where we were at the time, our altitude, our track, and then what we were going to do when we sensed the happening. And I just didn't believe they were capable of doing that. Anyway, we were concerned that there might be, something going on internationally, that we might start a war or something. So what we did, we drew our reconnaissance flights down about 30 miles. So we flew 30 miles south of the demilitarized zone and 30 miles south of these points that they were protesting in the ocean. Then I went to Okinawa, and I was in England when this happened. And then I transferred to Okinawa on September 24th, 1981. Just 2 days later, the Assistant Secretary of Defense, Frank Carlucci, who later became our Secretary of Defense, came to our detachment, and I was designated as briefing officer. We had a rule there that when you got to a foreign base, that you had to go into rest for 3 days before you could fly, just for jet lag. They were so careful about us, The other thing is that we had, by regulation, we had to be offered steak and eggs every time we flew. That's a low residue, high protein. And what a good deal that is. So anyway, the Secretary of Defense, Assistant Secretary of Defense came. I took him to the hangar. I showed him the answer to the SR-71. I answered questions. He asked me specifically about what our opinion was about getting these messages. And I told him, I says, we have a good time reading them. It's lots of fun. And furthermore, in Okinawa, we flew some training missions. And I just said, I don't think we ought to be flying training missions out of Okinawa. Every mission we fly ought to be a reconnaissance mission. And I don't know if that meant anything, but we didn't fly any training sorties after that. It was really nice. Then on October the 3rd, 1981, which is a couple of weeks later, the Air Force Vice Chief of Staff, name was General Robert Mathis, came to our detachment and briefed us on a mission that we were going to fly. He said that soon we would fly a mission exactly like the one that was fired on. It was a 2-loop mission. It first went between Taiwan and China, and then it made another loop around, refueled, and then it went by North Korea. He said that we would fly a mission exactly like that, and that he wanted us over that point where they were fired at within 30 seconds. And so the natural thing is, what's the reason for that? I mean, we must do whatever we're told, but I'm just wondering what the reason for that. And he said, well, that they plan to have 2 flights of, I think it was F-15s, air to ground capable. And if they fired at us, then the scenario would be the missile comes off the rail and immediately the missile launch site gets destroyed with 2 flights of F-15 air to ground missiles. So that's a you do that could be that could start another Korean War really easy. So we had a mission ladder, or a sortie ladder, that was sacrosanct. If I flew today, then the next mission is the other guys. We had 3 pilots there at all times, and we had our 2 primary positions are the crew that flies the mission And then the next up is the backup, because all of our missions were backed up. So anytime that we had a mission planning, both crews would do mission planning so that either crew would be ready to fly the missions. We also took a physical before each flight, nose, blood pressure, temperature, make sure that we could handle a decompression. And that there have been times that I've been put in, and one time that I had sniffles and I couldn't clear my ears, and the other guy took my place, which is none of us like that at all, but that's the way it goes. We were all very, we're jealous now, that we were very eager to fly our missions. So I was designated to be the pilot of this trolling mission that would go over this thing. So let's see. Jay Reed and I flew, Jay Reed, my backseater, flew the mission, and we known as the trolling mission on October 26, 1981. We took off early because if we took off late, we could make up our time, but taking off early, we had to lose some time. So we had some timing triangles built in which we had to do. And also we could lose some time while we were refueling. So anyway, we went over this thing, I think within 10 seconds. It was the backseater was the guy in charge of the timing. And he's the one who said, okay, push it up now. And go in there. It was beautiful. So we went over that thing right on time, and nothing happened. They didn't fire at us or anything. And then after that mission, we continued doing our normal reconnaissance missions. But I write this. Caller. Just a minute. Sorry about that. I didn't turn my phone off. I was going to say that I'm not a warmonger or anything, but I have to admit that I was a little disappointed that they didn't fire at us, because that would have shown the resolve of the Western world not to put up with that kind of stuff.
I bet the F-15 guys were disappointed too.
Probably. Yeah, that mission was so secret at the time that we had no communication with the fighters at all. I don't know who they were. They probably knew why they were flying there. I mean, sure they had to know that. But, I mean, it was interesting. The Secretary of Defense coming down and briefing, or who became one, and then the Vice Chief of Staff of the Air Force. Yes, sir. Anyway, that was, I think that question was, what was my most interesting or important mission? I think that was that.
Can I ask another question? Based on your relationship with your backseater, did you always fly with the same guy if possible? So you had that chemistry together kind of thing?
Yes, the answer is yes. But I was in there, I was in that program longer than anybody else. And so I had 4 backseaters. And Jay Reed was the first, and I love Jay Reed. Jay Reed's a wonderful guy. We went through that grueling year-long training together, simulators and all that stuff, where we were. I have to admit, I mean, I was a test pilot at Edwards, and I came in, and I was a little bit full of myself, and I, fly with the navigator. It was a little, I wasn't over the top, but that kind of was my attitude. And the first time that we flew, we also flew the T-38 more than we flew the SR, and the T-38 was just to keep because we didn't fly the SR that much, maybe 3 times, 4 times a month, once a week. So it was one time we were cross country in the T-38, and we were coming back, and the weather was in, and I was going to make an instrument approach. And so I just told Jay, I says, well, set up your instruments for an ILS to, runway 22. And he didn't know how to do that. He was a navigator, but he was a radar nav in B-52s, and radar navs had nothing to do with the operation of the airplane. It was just strictly the radar. And so I kind of chewed him out for not knowing that. And, was terrible that I did that. And he came to me, with a hat in hand, and says, well, can you teach me about that? Of course I can. That was, and that was kind of my realization that he was indispensable, and he was very good. If there was a checklist to be run, nothing would stop him from running that checklist. Not even me saying something. Anyway, he was good, and it didn't take that long for me to realize that I could not fly that airplane by myself. I mean, you could set up all the things to go on automatically and everything, but monitoring all the sensors and monitoring the navigation equipment, talking on the radio, running the checklist, all of that stuff, taking notes, he was indispensable. So it took two people to do that. That's really one of the reasons why the A-12, the original Blackbird, was a one-person airplane, a pilot only. And it was just too much for one pilot to do well and to do safely.
So
Last question.
how
Sorry.
long, I was going to say, how long from takeoff to get to maximum operating height then?
If you went directly from brake release to Mach 3 is about 13 minutes.
Wow. Wow. Yeah, I used to see you guys a lot up at Mildenhall. My father still lives up that way now. Since 1988, he's lived there, and he's not seen one SR-71. Not one. And I managed to see quite a few in the few years I was there.
Well, we had 10
And-
pilots at any time at one time. So if
Yeah.
you were there, I left the reconnaissance portion in 1984. So if you were there before 1984, you probably saw me.
No, we moved up there in 88. And was it true, as it still is now, that you were not allowed to overfly Newmarket because of the racehorses?
I had not heard that. No.
No.
It
Well,
was, they didn't want us deviating too much from anything because all of our flights were well programmed. The difference is that when we got back to the traffic pattern, they didn't have any rules for us to do. We could do what we wanted to do, touch and goes or instrument approach or flybys or something like that. So there have been times at Mildenhall that the controller would ask if I could. One time was Woodbridge, and I wasn't sure where Woodbridge was, but the navigator knew, so he put it in the nav system. So I did a low approach at Woodbridge for some people that the controller knew. And that was as formal as it was. And so if someone had asked me to overfly Newmarket, I would have done that too, with the controllers.
yeah, I don't think the racehorses would be very happy about that, but never mind. We don't worry about that.
Yeah, probably the controller would know that and would tell me not to do it. There was a time, there's a video on it. Maury Rosenberg, the guy that was flying the airplane when they shot at him. It's a funny video. He talks about the time that he came down after a mission at Beale Air Force Base, a training mission, and that I think someone asked him if he would make a low pass at Sacramento Airport, which is about 40 miles away. Well, sure I will. So he went down and did a low pass at Sacramento, and the tower controller said, "Could you come around and go down the ramp instead of the runway?" "Yeah, sure, I'll do that," says Maury. So he did that, and turns out that he panicked the terminal. People thought that airplanes were crashing all over. I mean, he was an afterburner, for heaven's sakes, and it was real loud and everything, and he caused quite a panic, and people were diving, under the seats. Right. That's the story, and that when Maury came, left that, he didn't know anything was going on. He landed at Beale. The the supervisor of flying, the full colonel, the guy in charge of all flying at Beale Air Force Base, met him, and we knew him, of course. And so Maury thought to himself, well, this is kind of neat. The supervisor of flying is coming out himself to meet me. And so when he got down off the ladder, and the supervisor of flying said, Maury, do you know of any regulation that would prevent an SR-71 from making a low pass at Sacramento Airport? Maury said, well, no, sir. I don't. He says, have that regulation on my desk at 7:30 in the morning. From that on, it was illegal to make a low pass at Sacramento.
Yeah, and when you were at Mildenhall, was there certain times of the day you weren't allowed to go out for noise abatement and stuff like that, or not?
I don't know. I wasn't in on that. I just flew when they told me to fly.
All right. Yeah, because I'm pretty sure I seen a couple go out at night, and like the reheats at night lighting up was just something out of this world.
Yeah, we always took off and reheat afterburner.
Yeah.
See you later, Kevin. Nice message.
I wonder what that was then.
Sorry, I've got to go. Thank you, Bredette. That was really interesting. Love to stay longer, but I've got to get up at 04:30 in the morning, so need to sign off.
Okay. Good
Cheers,
seeing
man.
you.
Thanks very much.
But Ed, apart from going back to the Air to 2 in '83, apart from that unfortunate paint incident, for which I apologize again, did you enjoy the show with all those F4s lined up and the U-2 alongside you, and all the fun of the Air to 2?
Absolutely. Yeah, I've been to many air shows. In fact, there's I've got some pictures of that air show on my YouTube channel, or not, I'm sorry, on my Facebook page. My Facebook page, if I am called, just like it is in the program announcement, Bredette BC Thomas. If you want to go there, if you just do BC Thomas, you'll probably find me. But my Facebook photograph, I'll show you what it is this.
Yeah.
So that's the main photograph. So if you look at that,
I was going to say that photograph of the F4s with the SR-71 and U-2s, which we've used quite a bit. After I retired from the Air to 2, they asked me to go out and see the heads of air forces around Europe just to say thank you and try and get some more airplanes. And when I went to the head of the Spanish Air Force, sitting in his office having a cup of coffee, directly behind him was that photograph of your airplane, the U-2, and that line of F4s. And I asked him why he got that photograph on the wall. He said, well, if you go to Phantom number 17 down that line, that was me. And I vowed that if ever I got into a position of power, because your parties were so good, I'd find a way to get back. And he said, I'm coming as a chief to the next Air to 2. But it was so nice to see that picture there. It's quite iconic. And in fact, on the anniversary of the Air to 2 in 2020, we produced a book year by year of what happened. And there's a lovely photograph of you in there, and some words from you, and that lineup of aeroplanes as well. And lots of comment about the Jim Jiggins departure.
As I say, on my Facebook page, if you go into the album, the pictures albums, there's one SR-71, and I think I have 3 pictures of me standing in front of the crowd at Greenham Common.
Were you aware of the incident that happened with the Lockheed motor car, the computer engineer that left his car parked by your airplanes with a box with wires hanging out of it?
No, I wasn't aware of that.
Okay, the security force saw it, assumed the worst, and we had to evacuate the Patrons Pavilion and the hospitality chalets. And it was mayhem. And it turned out Lockheed had just bought a flight planning computer company, the name of which I've forgotten now. And this guy was installing or fixing a couple of the computers that had failed, but he didn't think about what this box of wires looked like and caused mayhem.
That happens, you know. No, I've been to lots of air shows. Here's one that my air show, and that's kind of what it looks like. All those people are gravitating towards the airplane, and I always like that planform view. I think that kind of shows the airplane off to its good thing. Anyway, there's if you I already said that, the Facebook page. There's a lot more pictures of SR-71s there.
You've certainly had some interesting flying, haven't you? You lucky man.
Oh yes, you are correct. Yeah, professionally so. I've been very, very lucky.
I have a question from someone here that is not able to ask it because of microphone issues or something. But they were basically saying, what's the fastest the S1 has ever flown when getting out of Libya in '86?
I'm sorry, what was it?
So the question is, what's the fastest the SR-71 has flown when getting out of Libya in 1986?
Oh, I don't know. I wasn't there. That was Brian Schull. And he hints at Mach 3.5, which is not that much higher than 3.3. I mean, you're talking about 0.2 of a Mach number. So again, the SR-71 is point designed for Mach 3.2. Anything off of that is not optimum. The faster you go, the more dangerous it is. And I can tell you, there's a bunch of reasons why, if you want me to go into that. But if he did go to Mach 3.5, it wasn't for very long, and he might have. It's not. When I was at Edwards testing, we always tested like the DAFX equipment, the digital flight control system. We tested that at Mach 3.3 because that was the highest flight manual. We didn't. None of our operational missions were programmed for Mach 3.3. It was either Mach 2.8, Mach 3, or Mach 3.2. But we always had that pad that we could accelerate. That was one of our evade the missile procedures. So yeah, it's possible, but if he did it, he should have written it up, and he did not write it up. So I don't know. I wasn't there. I wouldn't challenge him on that. I'm sure that it would be easy to overshoot your target Mach. So I like Brian. Brian's a good friend of mine. Does any of you have his book, Sled Driver?
No.
Yes, incredible.
It costs about $400, something like that. He's really he's written 2 books on the SR-71 and then 1 each on the Blue Angels and the Thunderbirds. And he flew with the Blue Angels and Thunderbirds, so he's been around a lot.
Isn't Brian the infamous speed check SR-71?
Yes, he did that. Now it's a fun story, and again, I'm not going to challenge him on the veracity of that. It's a good story, and I'll just leave it at that. Now, the way he describes it is plausible. I've never heard the speed. Give me your ground speed. That thing. I guess it's possible. And it's a fun story, so I think that's the best you could say about it.
Yeah, well, surely you're traveling at that kind of speed, though. By the time you actually got the speed check requested and they send it back to you, you're out of their airspace anyway.
Well, it doesn't take long. They were nice to us in that we didn't have to change frequencies every time we went through a new control. The SR-71, we were VFR on top above 60,000, and so we could go any place and take any altitude as long as we didn't go below 60. And we were always on the same frequency, so that helped. Now the backseater, we talked on UHF. The backseater had UHF and VHF. Well, I had 2, but I didn't talk on VHF very much. But of course, most of the air traffic control stuff is on VHF.
Incredible.
Hey, I'd just like to ask a couple of questions. I'm reading this book at the moment. I've got the SR-71 book by what's his name? Colonel Richard H. Graham.
Yes,
I've got a
Rick
picture of
Graham.
you in here when you got your 1,217th flying hour, and I've got another picture of you in here with Jay Reed. Your I'm not sure if you can see the camera can see that. That
Uh,
one of you and Jay Reed and some other people.
I've got one of myself and Jay Reed. I've got one here.
I was going to ask you, out of
Go ahead.
all the aircraft you've flown, which is the hardest? Which one was the hardest to learn to fly?
SR-71.
Harder than the U-2? Because I've heard the U-2 is a really hard aircraft to learn to fly.
Well, the U-2 was, I mean, stick and rudder wise, the only thing really tricky about it is landing. And I can tell you a short story about that. My very first landing in the U-2. Now at Beale, the reconnaissance people were a lot more formal about their checkout than they were at Edwards. So I was a test pilot at Edwards, and we were expected to be able to look at an airplane and know how to fly it. I mean, that's an exaggeration, but the amount of ground school one-on-one with the instructor was minimal, so to speak. So when I certainly read the complete flight manual of the U-2 and, you know, went over it and checked the checklist and all that. But my instructor told me the way to land it. And he says, when you come in, you want to level off, you know, 3 feet above the runway, and you just bring the yoke back until you feel a shudder and a stall, and then it bumps down on the runway. And as soon as it hits the runway, it's going to want to do this. So be prepared to counter it. Okay, gotcha. So I say to myself, and this the arrogance of a test pilot, I'm so good, I will land this airplane just like I land any other airplane. You know, just come in and grease it on. And so, you know, thinking like that, you always get your comeuppance. So my first landing in the airplane, what's this stall stuff? I'm going to come in and just put it down gently on the, you know, the point of contact is the nose wheel, because you have a nose wheel and the tail wheel, and then the pogo's on the end. But this is, so you touch down on the, you're supposed to touch down on both of them when you stall, but I touch down on the nose wheel. As soon as I touch down, the airplane goes like this. I mean, it's bounced into the air, and I knew what the flight manual said about that. If you bounce in the air, do a go around. Don't try to salvage it, because you're coming up here, you're out of airspeed, and now you're not stalling out at 3 feet, you're stalling out at 15 feet. Not good. So I did a go around. Well, the A model, as I was checking out, is a J57 engine, and it had an engine chug. It was written up in the flight manual that when you, if you want to make a go around and you put the power up, you won't get any power for about 5 seconds. Well, 5 seconds is a long time when you're in a bounce. So just about the time it was coming back down to earth, that's when it caught, and I went on. And so I said to myself, listen to the test, to the pilot, to the instructor pilot. Well, the instructor pilot was on radio at the side of the runway. So I sheepishly said to him, his name was Jim. I said, Jim, would you please tell me when I'm 3 feet above the runway? Because I want to make sure, I don't want to stall this thing out at 5 feet. I want to stall it out at 3 feet. So he came around, and I very carefully, you know, flew at what I think was 3 feet. And then he called and says, you're at 3 feet. I'm like, yeah, that's the picture, you know, remember that picture. And then I brought the yoke back and stalled, and it was fine. So I got my arrogance shaved a little bit from that one too.
What
So
made
that's the most difficult thing. Okay, I say that's the most difficult thing.
What made the SR-71 such a difficult aircraft to learn to fly?
Because of the systems. It had a unique, it's the systems and the penalty for overspeeding, the penalty for stalling. The penalty for stalling that airplane is crashing. If you stalled the SR-71, it would go out of control. The fact that it's 1.5 G when you're going 2,000 miles an hour, you can imagine what the problems are associated with that. Here you are going through the air, and all you need to do is take the stick and go like that, and you've over-G'd it. And well, how much does it take to break up? We had one data point on that, and that was Bill Weaver, who established what the aft center of gravity limit was. They thought it was at 26%. Turns out to be it's 25%. He was at 26%, and he was in a right turn. He was at Mach 3.15, I think, and he had an unstart. An unstart is essentially the loss of thrust of one engine due to the shock wave inside the inlet being violently expelled. So he was in it, and this engine unstarted, which caused, now when you unstart, it always causes a yaw and a pitch up, because the yaw causes a pitch up because of the way it's made. So he was in a pitch up, he over-G's it, the airplane keeps pitching up. He goes to full stick, and because the CG is out of limits, out of what we know the limit is now, he didn't have the control authority to get the nose down. And about the time that the nose hit the peak, that's when the cockpit separated from the airplane due to overstress. And so he and his backseater come down, and this is in testing. He was a Lockheed test pilot. The backseater was killed, and he barely made it out alive. So based on that, we know what that the CG is, it can't get aft of 25. In addition to that, if you exceed Mach 3.2, then you have to put the CG forward. And I forgot what it was. It's like 0.5% for every 0.05 of a Mach, something like that. There's I forgot a lot of these limits, but you have to remember to do that. And if you don't, you're going to put the airplane in a position where you can go out of control. So that was the difficulty of flying the SR, was to be so precise and so careful and so particular about what your flight parameters are. Not to mention that when you have the cameras on, you got to hold the stick and make sure it doesn't wobble, so your pictures won't be fuzzy. So all of that was made for an interesting time.
Do you ever experience an unstart yourself?
Oh gosh, yes, lots of them.
Right. Was it quite a hairy moment, is it? Or...
Well, it's always unexpected, except I know about unstarts, but when they happen, I didn't know it was going to happen. And it's a loud bang, and then you lose about 70% of the thrust of whatever inlet is unstarted. That's how important the inlet is. There's a procedure for taking care of it. It is an emergency procedure. And the other thing is, if you had both engines unstarted in the unstart configuration, you could go to max reheat, afterburner, and you could maintain your altitude. Your Mach would start coming down, but you'd be burning gas, like it's going out of style. So you have to get that thing operating again, or go into a manual operation. And that was probably the most complicated maneuver that you could reasonably expect to do in the SR, was having this thing happen, a dynamic thing. You have to check for the inlet coming back into a normal condition. You have to check the EGT, because if you have a loss of normal airflow through the inlet, the EGT is going to go up. If it goes above 950 for 3 seconds, you have to shut down the engine. And that's been tested, because the engine would burn up. And so those things are pretty critical. So you have lots of things you have to do critically, and then to get the thing back. And then if there's a mechanical problem with an inlet, then you can go to a manual inlet, but going into that is another procedure that's quite complicated. And checking all these things, the compressor inlet pressure and the EGT were very important. You have a D-rich system that could trigger. The D-rich system would take fuel away from your engine. But that was the biggest part of learning to fly the SR-71, was taking care of that so that you could do it within 10 seconds. If you could do it within 10 seconds, and you're not going to notice a difference in fuel. Any more than that, then you're not going to have as much fuel when you get to your next action point, which could mean the loss of a mission. Sometimes we would have a bingo fuel that was 300 pounds difference. And they would, the planners, I mean, that's the way that they did it. And the planners really depended on us to make fuel, you know, to fly it so precisely and so well that we could take advantage if the outside air temperature was colder than normal. And also to fly it as precisely as possible. If everything was the way that it was planned, you would have a little bit more fuel than what they programmed. It was biased in the safe direction. But if you had an unstart and it took you a minute to get the thing back, you probably wouldn't make the next loop.
Did you get any warning of an unstart, or was it literally come out the blue?
A warning might be a rumble in the inlet. I've had that before. You ask about the different airplanes. 958 was a bad unstart airplane. And 972 was a beautiful airplane. I say the best that SR-71 that I've ever flown. It also had a different system for the trim, the engine trim. You could actually trim the engine in flight, change the EGT RPM relationship on that airplane. But that system was so costly, they decided not to put it in the whole system. The 972 kept it. And that's the one in the Smithsonian. Wonderful airplane.
I just want to ask if you're okay for any more questions, because we're approaching 2 hours now. So
That's fine. I don't care.
we've had a fantastic.
I'm enjoying this. It's great.
Yeah,
I mean,
it's brilliant, and I just want to thank you again for agreeing to speak to us and that. So if, you know, if you're still happy to continue, if everyone's got any more questions, we'll just continue for a few minutes or so.
Okay.
Did you say when you were